My name is Kristen Himmeline, and I'm a senior economist and statistician at the World Bank in the Poverty and Equity Global Practice. I'm also the co-lead for our Global Solutions Group on Data for Policy, which includes our innovative work on new sources of data. In this brief introductory presentation, I will talk a little bit about the history of small area estimation for monetary poverty at the World Bank, which we affectionately call poverty mapping, as well as talk about our current work and directions we believe this work will take in the future. Over the last 20 years, the World Bank has developed more than 140 poverty maps for nearly 100 countries and territories. These maps have become vital policy tools for governments and development partners to plan and monitor progress in poverty reduction and the achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals. Increasingly, these maps are used to identify poverty pockets, or areas at risk of being left behind as countries grow richer. Effectively targeting these areas is essential to eradicating global poverty, as more than 60% of the world's poor now live in middle-income countries. I will now go through a couple of examples of how we use poverty maps to identify poverty pockets. Ecuador, as shown here, is a middle-income country. The map on the left shows the direct estimates from the National Household Survey, while the map on the right uses small area estimation or poverty mapping to estimate poverty at the parish level, revealing poor areas in otherwise prosperous provinces. This also is useful in high-income countries. This map shows lagging areas in Croatia and correlates geographies with areas facing challenges in a number of other dimensions of development. So you can see we have consumption poverty on the left, and then we look at demography or aging populations, economic development, health and education, labor market, physical infrastructure, and social services. This map shows another application of small area estimation or poverty mapping. This is Suva, the capital of Fiji, and here our team worked very closely with the Fiji Bureau of Statistics to map the informal areas of the otherwise prosperous downtown area, clearly highlighting areas of poverty pockets, even though the overall downtown is prosperous. Small area estimation is the general name for a range of statistical techniques that combine data from two or more sources to produce a sufficiently precise estimate for subgroups below what would be possible based on direct estimates from a single survey. This literature dates back at least to the work of Bob Fay and Roger Harriott in 1979, though as Ghosh and Rao point out in their 1994 work, the antecedents date back even further. There are basically two kinds of models common in the small area estimation literature: unit level and area level models. Area level models, including Fay Harriott, use only aggregated auxiliary level information at the area level. The benefits of this approach are that the aggregated data are usually more readily available, and the approach avoids any potential issues with confidentiality. The main drawback is that it cannot be applied to places that are not covered in the survey. For example, if a survey covered 98 out of 120 districts in a country, with 22 not having any clusters selected by chance in the random selection process, it would not be possible to use an area-level model to generate estimates for these 22 districts. Unit-level models, on the other hand, predict results at the level of the unit of observation, which in the case of poverty mapping is the household, and then these results are aggregated up to administrative levels to present the findings. Elbers, Lanyau, and Lanyau, which developed an approach commonly used at the World Bank, and which we will discuss in more detail in this presentation, was one of the first applications of unit-level modeling to households, as previously most of the unit-level modeling was in agricultural applications, such as in crop yields. The interest in microestimates of economic well-being far predate our poverty mapping work at the World Bank. This slide shows an illustration from The Life and Labor of People of London, published by Charles Booth in 1889, and depicts Old Nickel, which was then a slum area in the east end of London near what I believe is present-day Shoreditch. The slum at the time was colloquially known as Sweater's Hell because it contained a large number of artisanal workshops that produced furniture for very low pay. And this quote, poverty map produced by Mr. Booth shows his classifications of this neighborhood into different economic strata. So it may be a little bit difficult to read the key here, but the darkest blue is classified as, quote, lowest class, vicious and semi-criminal. Things improve to dark blue, which are classified as very poor and in chronic want, up through lighter blue and mauve to light pink, which are classified as fairly comfortable, good ordinary earnings, into middle class and well-to-do, and finally to yellow, which is upper middle class and wealthy. The origins of poverty mapping at the World Bank began with the Elbers, Lanyo, and Lanyo Econometrica paper published in January 2003. The main innovations of this paper were, as I mentioned earlier, the paper applied unit-level modeling to households, as well as developed an approach to deal with non-normality. While the paper itself represented an important achievement, the ELL approach really gained popularity with the introduction of POVMAP software. This was a point-and-click interface that made the complicated calculations of small area estimation accessible to a wider audience, particularly in the developing world. It shows a quick graphical depiction of the ELL process. Imagine you have a fictional island with a poverty rate of 15%, indicated in yellow. This is calculated from individual households selected in a survey. The households in their clusters are shown here, with the colors indicating the level of poverty. A model then predicts income for all census households. And these results are then aggregated into a lower administrative level than would be possible with the survey alone using direct estimates. The ELL approach to the construction of the poverty map basically takes place in two steps. Working first with the household survey data, the beta model is developed using an ordinary least squared prediction approach with either income or consumption as the dependent variable being modeled. Other options from the machine learning literature have been explored, but we have generally returned to an OLS-based approach as some of the more alternative selection techniques tend to leave insignificant variables in the model, which introduce noise and reduce the precision in the resulting predictions. Once variable selection for the beta model is complete, a second OLS model is used to model the variance and account for potential heteroscedasticity. This is called the alpha model. The alpha model yields a sigma squared at the level of each household, allowing for different variances for different households. Finally, a generalized least squared or GLS model is run to yield the final coefficients and any other necessary parameters for the simulation step. Step 2 is that simulation, and it applies the model to the census using Monte Carlo simulations. This process is somewhat similar to multiple imputation approaches in that it generates a vector of possible values for y, which is our variable of interest here, either income or consumption, which are then used to estimate the uncertainty and generate confidence intervals. This last step is critical to the small area estimation process because the intention of small area estimation is to generate estimates of sufficient precision for areas and subpopulations below what is possible from the direct survey estimates. But it's not possible to determine what qualifies as sufficient precision without an accurate assessment of the uncertainty. The question as to whether the ELL approach accurately represented the uncertainty led to criticism from some very well-known figures in the fields of economics and statistics. A key criticism was that the correlates of poverty alone were not sufficient in some areas. For example, you may have areas that are well endowed according to the available variables that are doing quite well, while you may have other areas which are also well endowed based on the available variables that are actually performing poorly. Or in other words, the ELL approach was missing an important unobservable area effect. The issues with ELL have led recent work on small area estimation at the World Bank in different direction, using an empirical Bayes approach based on the work of Isabel Molina and John Rao. This new work is extremely promising because it represents a convergence between the World Bank's work historically with the wider small area estimation statistics field. To address the issues noted in the previous slide of using only poverty correlates, empirical Bayes integrates a fitted area level model of the means for our variable of interest, and this anchors the resulting estimates with a location effect. It also uses a different approach to calculating uncertainty, which is more consistent with the current small area estimation literature. Finally, I should note that we are also exploring integrating geospatial and other indicators calculated from big data sources into our poverty mapping work. This is increasingly possible as costs fall and the quality of the imagery increases, and is attractive because coverage is universal and the imagery is updated regularly. And there's not some of the same measurement concerns that are inherent to survey data. There are limitations, though. Big data doesn't always fit into neat structural models in the way socioeconomic variables do, and there are some concerns about the stability of estimates. Having said that, though, early work shows promise, and this is an active area of research for us. And with that, I will... Normally at this point in the presentation, I would take questions, but unfortunately, due to the virtual format, we'll have to close here. I have my contact information on this slide. I'm happy to respond to questions by email, and I'm also happy to connect to some of my colleagues who are leading this work at the bank. Thank you very much.
Hi, good morning, good evening, wherever you are. My name is Marshall Burke. I am an associate professor of Earth System Scientist, actually a social scientist by training here on the faculty at Stanford, and also co-founder of Atlas AI, which is a startup in Silicon Valley that tries to use some of the satellite and machine learning technologies that I'll talk about here in a moment to make measurements at scale of economic livelihoods. So let me share my screen. And I should also start by thanking multiple collaborators on this work, mainly at Stanford and also at Atlas, David Lobel, Stefano Ehrman, a number of excellent graduate students who we've worked with over the years. Okay, so of course, I don't know exactly what Kristen has said already. I am sure she has given an excellent overview of sort of where we are in the data situation on the ground, and I think is setting us up to talk about how some of these new technologies might help. But let me give my own sort of data quantitative view of the data situation on the ground. So we care about measuring economic livelihoods. We care about doing that so we can understand the impact of interventions in the world, so we can track progress towards specific outcomes towards the Sustainable Development Goals. And our key technology for making measurements on the ground has been household surveys. This is something we know how to do well in the profession. And again, it's the key input to many of these measurements that we care about. Unfortunately, in many parts of the world, these measurements are infrequent. Here I am showing you a map of the frequency of nationally representative economic surveys. These are consumption expenditure surveys conducted around the world. So the darker reds and the blacks are places that conduct surveys infrequently. And you can see in many parts of sub-Saharan Africa, surveys are, if lucky, happen once a decade and sometimes more infrequently. So that's a problem if we care about measuring these outcomes and tracking them over time. And as you can see in panels B and C here, the frequency of surveys is positively correlated with per capita GDP. So we get more surveys in wealthier countries and fewer surveys in poorer countries. Similarly, more democratic countries have historically conducted more ground surveys. And so in autocracies around the world, we tend to have less data. So arguably, in the places where we are in most need of data, what's going on the ground, people's livelihoods, we have the least amount of data, at least looking historically. And even where we have these nationally representative surveys, they're typically not available, or they're only very coarsely available to the public. So many of these will be summarized on surveys like on websites like PovCal, but they'll have no spatial information besides knowing that you are in Kenya in 2005, for instance. So that makes it really hard to do a lot of the things that we would like to do with these surveys, at least as researchers and also as practitioners on the ground, to understand where progress is being made and where in a given country progress is not being made. So that's a challenge. So I want to talk to you about work that we and others have done. Ingmar is also giving a talk either before or after me. He's done excellent work on this as well, as have many other researchers that try to use new types of technology to shed light and help plug these very important data gaps around the world. And the technology I'm going to focus on in the next few minutes is satellites. And of course, this is not a new idea. People have been looking at satellite images of various types for a long time and thinking about how they might be used for these sorts of applications. So why might satellites be useful if this wasn't obvious already? Well, number one, you can look at two different images. Here is an image of the UN in New York, in Manhattan. So on the left is an image of Manhattan. On the right is a Google image of a place we work in Kenya during the dry season. So I think you can readily distinguish differences in wealth and likely differences in per capita expenditure between these two images just by looking at them. So humans can distinguish income levels or consumption expenditure levels pretty rapidly in imagery. It turns out computers are getting quite good at image recognition tasks. So the canonical image recognition tasks are these ones that figure out which pet is which, right? Is this a dog, a cat? Is it a hamster or a weasel? And as of a few years ago, humans were now being outperformed by computers on this task. So remarkably, humans still mess this task up about 5% of the time, at least according to this ImageNet calculation, and computers mess it up very rarely now. So computers are getting very good at recognizing things in images. And there's a lot of new images to play with. And here we're not thinking about photographs from the ground, like traditional camera-based photographs that we might take on our phone. We're thinking about images from the sky, so satellite images. And I think what's really important to recognize is how rapidly this has changed over time. So here I am showing you a plot of revisit rates, and I have calculated survey-based revisit rates. So this is household survey-based revisit rates at the household level across sub-Saharan Africa. That's this bottom line. And revisit rates from household surveys across the US. And of course, we take samples. We don't need to see all houses unless we're trying to do a census. So most of these surveys never try to get all households, but imagine you were. How long would it take at current revisit rates to get all households in sub-Saharan Africa? Or a given household in sub-Saharan Africa, it would take about 1,000 years before any given household gets resampled based on our current survey rates. In the US, it's something more like 10 to 30 years. So very infrequently are we going to see each individual house, right? That's not true in satellite imagery. Satellites are passing overhead all the time. They are passing overhead increasingly frequently. And thanks to some new entrants in the satellite market from a few years ago, including private sector entrants like Planet Labs, now just called Planet, and the European Space Agency's Sentinel constellation. So Sentinel-2 is one we'll use a lot. These take images of nearly the entire Earth at least once a week, and more like once a day if you're looking at Planet. And so just in the past few years, we have just an explosion of imagery available for this task. And so we want to understand, can it be used to, in combination with these new methods from machine learning that help us understand what's in imagery, can these two technologies be combined to help solve this fundamental data problem that we have? Okay, so how are we going to do that? We're thinking about filling both the temporal gaps between surveys as well as the spatial gaps between surveys. I'm mainly going to talk about evaluation on the spatial side today. So here's basically how these models work. So you have imagery as inputs, and then you have some outcome that you're trying to predict. And most of what I'll show you today is as asset wealth. This is well measured in publicly available georeference surveys. And here I'm mainly going to use the demographic and health surveys that are, again, public. They're very consistent across countries. They're georeferenced, and they're available to a researcher like me. So you have an outcome you're trying to predict. You have an imagery input. And sitting between those two things, you have some sort of model that interprets the images and makes a prediction. And here we're going to use deep learning, and this is basically a set of techniques that has come out of computer science, again, mainly in the domain of the photographs that we had seen before, and we're going to apply these deep learning models to satellite images. And we're going to use various types of satellite images to try to make progress here. We're going to use nighttime lights images, which I assume most folks are familiar with. We're going to use multispectral daytime imagery. In this study I'll show you here, we're using Landsat. We can use higher resolution imagery. I can show you some results on that. And so you can see sort of snapshots. This is just in a corner in coastal Nigeria. So here's nighttime lights imagery. Here's the multispectral imagery for the same region. And then these dots are what we're going to try to predict. And the redder dots are poorer asset wealth. So we have village level measurements of asset wealth, and the bluer dots are wealthier regions. So basically, we're going to try to use these two imagery inputs to predict these outcomes. In this study that I'll show you that was just published a few months ago, we used data across sub-Saharan Africa, roughly 20,000 villages. And again, these data are from the demographic and health surveys. I'm watching my time here. Okay. So quickly, the model does pretty well. We're able to explain 70% of the overall variation in a given country. And we actually push these models pretty hard. We evaluate them in countries where the model has not been trained. So imagine training a model in Tanzania and applying it to Kenya without training it in Kenya, and then evaluating it on data that you actually have in Kenya, but that you didn't let the model see. So we are evaluating them out of sample. Each dot here is an individual village. And again, there's some variation around a lot, but we explain 70% of the overall variation in asset wealth. If we aggregate up, we do even better. We explain 80 to 85% of the variation. That's consistent with errors canceling. Okay, And in a recent review paper that's in review now, happy to share it with folks if they're interested. We have gone back and done a meta-analysis of all the published studies that look at the same outcome using satellite imagery and tracked their performance over time. And people are doing pretty well, I guess, overall at this test. So most studies, most published studies that we could find explain at least 70% of the variation in ground data, so performance similar to what I just showed you. And the dark dots here, so each different dot or triangle is a study, and the darker dots are ones that combine satellite imagery with other inputs. I think Ingmar is going to give an example of that. And those, if anything, seem to do slightly better. So it's not just satellites here that could be useful, it's other inputs as well. Okay, so one question I want to ask before stopping is, okay, so you explained 70% of the variation. Is that good enough? And good enough is in quotes there because it's often not clear exactly what that means. Is it good enough for some downstream application that we care about? And the two relevant questions really I think you want to answer to that is, where are the errors coming from? So we might assume that all the errors, the imperfections in that R squared are coming from errors in the satellite imagery, but it could also be the case that there's sampling variation or outright errors in our ground data. And we need some way to adjudicate that. And second, I think, and this goes back to the first plot I showed, the first map I showed, what's the counterfactual? If you didn't have these satellite-based estimates, what would you be using otherwise? And I think in many countries, you wouldn't have a lot to use. So let me talk briefly about these two before finishing. So one way we thought about diagnosing where the error comes from is, so you have two measurements of a thing that you care about, and we're assuming you don't actually observe the thing that you care about. You have two measurements of it. You have one ground-based survey measure and you have a satellite-based measure. How do you figure out which is more accurate? So what we do is we compare them to an independent third estimate of the same thing. And here we're going to use data from censuses, so independent surveys that measure asset wealth in a similar way. And we can take each of our measurements, our ground-based measure and our satellite-based measure, and compare them to our third measure. And if they compare roughly similarly, then we're going to say they're roughly of equal noise. And that's indeed what we find. When we do that and compare them against censuses across 10 different countries in sub-Saharan Africa, we find pretty similar comparisons. And that to us suggests the sort of take home at the bottom, that at least some of the imperfection in the R squareds that I showed you is due to noise in the ground data. Time check, I think I'm just about out of time. Okay. So that's good news. That means the satellites are actually doing a pretty good job and maybe are on par with the quality of the measurements that we get out of the satellite data. Finally, let's think about the counterfactual. If we don't have satellites, what are we going to use? Again, in many places, this counterfactual is not great. We might never have had a survey. We might not have had one for 20 years. And so arguably, you might be willing to, if not take a chance on satellites, be willing to give it a try, given that you don't have an expenditure survey recently that you can use. Okay, and finally at Atlas AI, one thing we're trying to do is actually scale these estimates. So we generate them across the sub-Saharan African continent, and we update them over time as new imagery comes in. Imagery is rolling in all the time. We can re-update these estimates. We can put them on a map. And we're very excited to work with policymakers and practitioners on the ground to get these data into your hands and to help you use them and make sense of them. So please reach out to me if that's of interest. Sorry this was so quick. So here are my two emails, Burke at Stanford and Marshall at Atlas. And again, I think the message here is these two data sources are really complements rather than substitutes. They're going to work together, and we want to think of satellites as not replacing ground-based surveys, but as really helping plug the gaps where we can't get in and do surveys. So I'll stop there and thank you very much.
Welcome to my presentation on combining social media data and satellite imagery for poverty mapping. My name is Ingmar Weber and I'm from the Qatar Computing Research Institute. This is joint work with a number of people, in particular Masumali Fatekia, who's a research assistant at QCRI. In this work, we combine social media data and satellite imagery. So what type of social media data? We're using Facebook audience estimates. So let me explain this. Here, you're seeing a screenshot of Facebook's advertising platform where I'm targeting people who live in this particular part of Doha, who have a particular age, particular gender, who used to live in either India or Nepal, and importantly, who are using Android devices to access Facebook. Why is the device type of interest? Well, put simply, Android devices are cheaper than iOS devices. So knowing in which part of a city people are more likely to use iOS devices or Android devices is a strong signal of the relative distribution of wealth. Similarly, whether people use 4G, 3G, or Wi-Fi are also other signals combined with Facebook penetration itself that we're using in our models. Now, before we launch an advertising campaign, Facebook provides us with information about how many people match our targeting criteria. So in this case, it's 42,000. So this is, one type of feature that we use in our model. So what's the percentage in a particular location that uses, let's say, iOS versus Android or vice versa. So through this type of data, we obtain a number of interpretable features. Just as a sort of proof of concept to show, that these are actually predictive of relative distribution of wealth. Here I'm showing a screenshot from this data visualization where I'm showing the relative distribution of iOS users. So in Lower Manhattan and Midtown, you have about 90% of Facebook users using iOS devices, whereas in the Bronx with lower income, it's only between 40 and 50%. Similarly, in other parts of the world, in Lagos, if you look at where the government is located, you have about 15% of Facebook users using iOS devices, whereas in the rest of Lagos, it's only 7 to 8%, indicating that, quite likely there's higher wealth here and lower wealth in the rest of you don't have to use screen scraping to collect this data. You can collect this type of data through the official Graph API that Facebook provides. So this is the social media data. On the satellite imagery data side, we use data collected through the Google Static Maps API. This originally is provided by Maxa. And for this, we're using squares of either 10 by 10 kilometers in rural areas or 5 by 5 kilometers in urban areas, somewhat reflecting the spatial noise that DHS uses. How do we extract features from this? Here we're not innovating. We're just using existing work that uses networks fine-tuned on estimating nighttime light intensity. So for this, I would just point you to the reference. Main point here is that in the end, we have a high-dimensional representation of about 4,000 dimensions for any given location. To evaluate our approach, we use data from DHS for the Philippines and for India. DHS provides an asset ownership-based wealth index. So basically areas where people have own more stuff, are areas with a higher wealth index, and conversely areas where people own less stuff, the wealth index is lower. And so now we have this data that for the Philippines from 2017 for a set of about 1.2 thousand locations, for India 28,000 locations, a couple of years old. So unfortunately the temporal match is not perfect with the Facebook data, which is from 2019. Still, we are sort of trying to evaluate it in a sort of outcasting approach. The ground truth data is noisy. So first it's a sample, it's not an enumeration. Then there's spatial noise that's introduced to protect privacy. In combination, there's certain upper bounds that no method could beat in terms of expected sort of R squared. So this is about 0.84 for the different countries. So later when you see R squared values, sort of keep in mind these sort of upper bounds to compare against. And there are details in the references at the end. We're doing this both in India, where Facebook penetration is about 21%, and in the Philippines, where it's about sort of 65%, so quite a bit higher. Model fitting, again, this is just sort of standard so the sort of the game that we are playing in a sense is we are sort of trying to predict the wealth index from DHS. So this is the target variable. We are doing this using a number of predictive features, both from Facebook and from satellite imagery. We try different regression models. In this case, it turns out that rich regression is best. So it's a simple linear regression with a regularization element. Everything is evaluated in a 10-fold cross-validation setting. We try different models, but in this case, rich regression perform best. So how well do these different data sets perform? So for if you use only Facebook data, so nothing else, and this includes Facebook penetration, you get an R squared, so the percentage of the variance that's explained for the Philippines of about 0.6. If you use only satellite imagery, you get something that's actually quite similar. If you add additional variables related to population density and also sort of regional dummies, then the Facebook data sort of improves in its performance, as does the satellite imagery. Still, they're somewhat similar. And if you put everything together, you get slightly higher performance. In India, it's a shorter story. Basically, there, satellite imagery performed always better than Facebook imagery, Facebook data. And you don't really gain much, if anything, by adding Facebook data. And this is likely due to the much lower Facebook penetration in India as compared to the Philippines. But then also, quite interestingly, as you sort of disaggregate by urban and rural areas, you see an interesting pattern. So let me explain this. So this is the same performance that I showed before for Facebook alone or satellite alone for all of the Philippines. But then if you disaggregate and you train a model just for urban areas and just for rural areas, so first the overall R² goes down because there's less variance left to be explained because they are more homogeneous, so that makes sense. But then interestingly, for urban areas, Facebook alone is better than satellite alone, but for rural areas, satellite alone is better than Facebook alone, right? So this also makes some sort of sense because typically in urban areas you have higher Facebook penetration. Similarly, if you add additional features and then if you put everything together, you sort of get the best of both worlds. Again, in India, Facebook data does not add any value over using satellite imagery alone. Right? And so this sort of illustrates that, in particular, in countries with fairly high Facebook penetration, and there, in particular, in urban areas, Facebook is likely to provide additional value over using satellite imagery for modeling spatial distribution and wealth. Poverty. But then one of the things that you can also do with these Facebook advertising audience that you can't do quite as easily with satellite imagery is you can build models for demographically disaggregated wealth estimates. So how does this work? So basically we have a model that's trained in a non-disaggregated manner. So what you saw so far is just the wealth index as a household level, but then we apply it the same model, just to women or just to young people, etc. Right? So instead of using the feature, what's the percentage of all Facebook users using iOS, we would look at just, well, what's the percentage of women using iOS, or what's the percentage of young people who predominantly access Facebook through 4G, or what's the percentage of university graduates who have particular devices, let's say, such as the iPhone X, etc. And so the beauty of this is that to apply this, we don't actually need disaggregated training data. So the features are disaggregated, but it's trained on a household level data. So if this gives any sort of sensible. So here I'm showing data for the Philippines where every data point is a cluster. So it's a sort of basically like a sample of about sort of 40 households. On the y-axis, you have the prediction of the wealth index just for female users, and on the x-axis, the prediction just for male users. And you can see that surprisingly, in most locations, these are quite similar. The color indicates the number of Facebook users, whereas, put quite simply, sort of red areas are, urban areas, denser areas, and blue areas are sort of rural areas. Now, so this was somewhat surprising that, female predictions are so close. So that means that they have similar types of devices, similar types of Facebook access. But in the case of the Philippines, it actually makes some sense. So here I'm showing data from the Global Gender Gap report, which overall ranks Philippines quite highly. And in particular, if you look at the economic participation and opportunity value, then it's sort of has a value of about 0.8. So 1.0 would be perfect gender equality, so definitely Philippines hasn't achieved gender equality, but on a global scale, it's doing actually relatively well. So at least some of these sort of predictions might be at least sort of plausible, but ultimately we don't know because we don't have good ground truth to validate against. What about other demographic disaggregation? So here I'm showing age disaggregated predictions. Where wealth index predictions for older people is on the y-axis, younger people on the x-axis, where in sort of rural areas, the model predicts higher for younger people, whereas in urban areas, it's about equal, or if anything, probably older people are at an advantage. So again, this would be interesting to sort of validate if this actually checks out. And last but not least, if you look at the self-declared education level, so people who have higher than high school are predicted to do better or have more sort of wealth basically in all parts of the Philippines, again, which makes sort of sense. So that's a clear sort of pattern. And so this seems reasonable to say the very sort of so now where could this approach add a value? So in the Philippines, yeah, maybe sort of or so. It seems promising. India, probably not. As I mentioned, just Facebook penetration is not high enough. What would be other sort of promising countries? So for example, like a country such as Indonesia, where there's also more than 50% sort of Facebook penetration, might also be quite sort of promising to explore this approach more. a summary. So what are some of the downsides of this approach? So it's challenging in low population areas. So it's not the spatial size, but the population size is sort of so, because you basically, once you go below 1,000 users, Facebook doesn't provide sort of data. So very, very low population areas are harder to estimate. As a consequence, we had to drop about 1% of DHS clusters in our evaluation, which are likely to be the poorest sort of clusters. So this is probably some bias introduced there. It's not clear how stable these models are long-term, sort of. So I mean, that's generally for all these sort of approaches sort of hard to evaluate, sort of. So for this, we first have to build up a data set across several years. Can it catch sudden temporal changes? Maybe, sort of so, right? Like sort of so. It's not clear if people sort of sell their phone once they sort of lose their job, or sort of so. Maybe, but if they do, then we will sort of catch this. It's nice that it taps directly into an asset ownership, right? So we measure one type of asset ownership sort of quite directly, sort of so. As such, there's like a sort of causal link. We can disaggregate demographically. There's another sort of plus. It doesn't break down at the lowest decile. I didn't show this here in detail, but you'll find this in the references, sort of so, where we try to also evaluate the performance across different sort of the whole spectrum of the wealth index. And in particular, there's value to combine it with other data sets, such as satellite imagery, but maybe also other features. I'm flashing these sort of references here if you want to sort of learn more details about the work. And then, yeah, thank you very much for listening. If you have any questions, please don't hesitate to get to reach out to me. Here's my email address, and there are additional details on these two websites. So yeah, stay safe, and too bad we don't get to meet in person this year. Okay, take care. Bye bye.
Dear colleagues, it's my pleasure to be part of the panel for the session on Leaving No One Behind. Small area estimation with new data and new methods. My name is Yung Yimin. I'm from the United Nations Statistical Division of Department of Economic and Social Affairs. My presentation today will focus on small area estimation for monitoring the SDGs. In committing to the realization of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, member states recognized that the dignity of the individual is fundamental, and that the agenda's goals and targets should be met for all people and for all segments of the society. Ensuring that these commitments are translated into effective actions requires a precise understanding of target population. To properly measure this, statistics need to be presented in a disaggregate way, displaying figures for different population groups and regions. So in the SDG targets, many of the specific population groups have been mentioned. For example, in target 1.2, that reducing multidimensional poverty rate according to national definition, men, women, children of all age are specified. For target 5.4, ensure equal access to all levels of education and vocational training. And here, persons with disabilities, indigenous people, and children in vulnerable situations are particularly mentioned. For target 8.8, that protect labor rights and promote safe and secure working environment for all workers, that migrant workers, and particular women migrants that are mentioned. So the global indicator framework also has included an overarching principle of data disaggregation, which states sustainable development goals indicators should be disaggregated where relevant by income, sex, age, race, ethnicity, migratory status, disability, and geographical location, or other characteristics in accordance with the fundamental principle of official statistics. However, the disaggregated data needed to address all these vulnerable groups, including children, youth, women, persons with a disability, people living with HIV, older persons, indigenous people, refugees, internal displaced persons, and migrants as specified in the 2030 Agenda are sparse. Few of the current SDG indicators, for example, are able to shed light on the particular situation of migrants, refugees, old persons, persons with disabilities, minorities, and indigenous people. So many countries are struggling to collect and use these aggregate data, and there's intensive need for more guidance and share of experiences. So the interagency and expert group on SDG indicator, which composed of member states, was tasked to develop and implement the global indicator framework for the SDGs. One of the main focus area of the IAG SDGs work in 2020 is on data disaggregation. Using small area estimation methods to improve SDG data availability for vulnerable population groups is one of the priority areas of work for the IAG SDGs. So there are also great demands from country on providing technical guidance and training in this area. So to meet this, the need of national statistical offices on building capacity in this area, the interagency and expert group on SDG indicator and the intersecretarial working group on household survey jointly established a task force on small area estimation. Small area estimation techniques have been proved to be very useful to provide reliable disaggregate data for some SDG indicators. This technique can produce estimates for specific subpopulations or small areas. So a small area can refer to a subgroup of the population for which the sample size is so small that direct estimates are not reliable enough to be published. Other examples include small area include a geographic region such as a province, a municipality, or county, or a demographic group or disaggregate by age and sex, or a demographic group within a graphic regions. So this technique, small area estimation, has been used to produce estimates for some of the SDG indicator, such as the most popular use is on poverty estimation, producing poverty map. Many countries has done so. And another area is on food insecurity, on the nourishment, including children who are stunted. It's also applied in many health-related indicators, such as under 5 mortality rate, family planning indicators, such as unmet need for family planning, married women currently using any modern method on contraception, on vaccination rate, women with anemia, and antenatal visit for pregnant women. It also has been used to measure the literacy rate by sex. It's used for goal 6 and population living household using improved water resources or use improved sanitation sources. It has been used for measure unemployment rate and the access and use of ICT by household residents. So as I mentioned earlier, the IGSDG and the Intersecretarial Working Group on Household Survey jointly established this United Nations Task Force on Small Area Estimates for SDGs. The main goal of this task team is to provide practical tools with accompanying case study for country to use SAE for the SDG monitoring. Some of the objectives of this task team include to standardize the small area estimation applications and the assessments of the methodologies, to encourage the provision of small area estimation methodology in standard statistical software, and to centralize relevant documents of reference. So the target audience of this practical guidelines will be the practitioners, which are the statistical office that are interested in using this technique for the monitor of the SDGs. for this guidelines provide practical tools on how to conduct the analysis, also with reference for very more detailed information. And the guidelines will not cover and explain the statistical models in details. We'll focus on country examples and case studies covering different SDG indicators. The set of the guidelines also include the guidelines on communicating the SAE estimates to policymakers and general public, and also how to visualize these estimates. Furthermore, and the majority of the proposed methodology should be available in softwares. So the current member of the task force include international and regional organizations, such as the UN Statistical Division and UN Population Fund, Food Agriculture Organization, and UN Regional Commission in Latin America, and the Asian Development Bank, UNICEF, and also this Inter-Secretary Working Group on Household Survey. We also have member states that National Statistical Office in Canada, Colombia, and UK. In addition, we have experts from NGOs and academia, such as the University of Florida, Universidad Carlos Terceros de Madrid, ID Insight, and also additional experts. The main outline of this practical guidelines include the introduction and objective section, and the core concept of the SAE section is to answer the questions why and when to use the small area estimation method, and furthermore, it gave a brief introduction of the core idea and concept of small area estimations. The section on SE by indicators will collect case studies that describe application for various indicators using different models. The section on producing SAEs describes a framework for the production of the small area estimates that is used to explain the various steps to produce the estimates. And furthermore, a range of overview paper and well-recognized books from this field of research are summarized. The section on communicating SAE will include the suggestion on visualize the estimates, and also describe how the SEG result could be communicated to policymakers and the general public. Some of the software have used for SAE include commonly used software package for include R, Stata, SAS, Python, and others. So this is the outline of the practical guidelines. We're looking for more country examples and case studies cover different SDG indicators. So here I would like to call for contributions. If you need more information about this task team and the work, so please contact my colleague, Ms. Hao-Yi Chen, who is coordinator of the Inter-Secretary Working Group on the Household Survey, or you can contact me. So thank you very much for your attention.
Hello, everyone. My name is Sanan Zhang, Technical Specialist at the United Nations Population Fund. My work areas focus on the interlinkages of population dynamics with broader sustainable development issues using innovative analytical methods. I'm very happy to have this opportunity to introduce UNFPA's work on small estimation through a case study we developed applying small estimation to family planning indicators. Following the case study, I'm going to briefly discuss the potentials of applied methods to other SDG indicators and the opportunities of using the upcoming 2020 round of census. Okay, I'm going to share my presentation slides. This small area estimation case study I'm going to present is applied in family planning indicators in Nepal. I'd like to give my special thanks to the project collaborators, my colleagues at the UNFPA headquarters, UNFPA Nepal Country Office, and the Nepal Central Bureau of Statistics. I'm starting with data disaggregation challenges. Many SDG indicators, including health-related indicators or family planning indicators, are only available in household surveys such as DHS and MIGS. Due to the limited sample size, data can only be disaggregated to regional level or provincial level. The international agenda such as Agenda 2030, ICPD Agenda, African Union Agenda 2063, collectively pose an enormous pressure to national statistic systems to deliver the data required to track progress over time. Especially, there is an increasing demand for local level estimates. This needs the countries to develop their capacity to conduct small area estimates for key indicators that are routinely collected in surveys, but not in census. The indicators that we estimated using small area estimation are family planning indicators. SDG indicator 3.7.1 is the proportion of women of reproductive age who have their need for family planning satisfied with modern methods. To calculate this indicator, three other indicators needed. They are contraceptive prevalence rate using modern methods, and unmet need for family planning rate. This small estimation case study is applied in Nepal using demographic and health survey data and national population and housing census data. Both data sets were collected in 2011. Here is the sub-regional level disaggregation used DHS for the three indicators, CPR, unmet need for family planning, and the proportional demand satisfied. However, when disaggregating the indicators to district level, the sample size is too small, and 3 districts have no data collected. Therefore, data disaggregation below sub-regional levels is not recommended. Small area estimation is introduced as an alternative to estimate these indicators. There are different methods available for small estimation these days. In this case study, I'm going to introduce the method that integrating population census and the DHS survey data, taking advantage of the common variables available in both data sets and can be used to predict family planning indicators. The method is revised based on the ELL methodology. There are 4 major steps for small area estimation. First is the analysis of census data and the household survey data for the common variables associated with contraceptive indicators. Then the second, we develop a model to predict the probability of individual contraceptive use using household survey data, and then apply the model to census data to estimate the probability of individual contraceptive use. Since the census data count everyone, the results allow us to aggregate the estimation of individual contraceptive use to different geographic levels. There are 15 variables identified for family planning models. These variables were selected based on literature review of the factors affecting people's use of contraception and then the assessment of data sets comparing census data and the DHS data. The variables covered the characteristics of individuals and households, as well as the building materials and other socioeconomic factors. We use logistic regression model to predict each indicator at individual level. So here is the formula for probability of contraception use for each individual person. To identify the best logistic regression model, we tested different models and compared the accuracy levels. This figure illustrated the relationship between the predicted values using models with the observed values using DHS data. Results show that National Fixed Effect Model is recommended among the models we tested. We applied cross-validation for accuracy assessment and using 50% of samples to generate models and then apply the model to the other 50% samples. The results of accuracy level is shown in log curves, and it includes true positive and false positive elements. Here are the 3 log curves for the 3 indicators. The area under the curve is around 75 for all the 3 indicators. We also conducted uncertainty analysis by mapping the relative confidence interval range. And here is the relative confidence interval range for the first indicator and the second indicator. And then the third indicator, unmet need for family planning rate. So compare the 3 indicators, and the uncertainty level is getting a little higher for the unmet need for family planning. Using the small estimation model results, we explored the determinants of the family planning indicators. The figures on the left listed the 13 subregions, and the figure on the right listed all the variables used in the model. So from the figures, we can say that some subregions, like East Mountain and then the East Hill, do have like more influence on family planning comparing to other subregions. And then the variables like A. Next, I'm going to show the mapping results of the estimates. The first indicator is contraceptive prevalence rate. The map at the lower left corner is a direct disaggregation to subregional level using DHS survey data. The map in the middle is the small error estimation of the indicator at VDC level, which is Village Development Committee level, equal to municipality level. And we can see a lot of geospatial variance across the country. The second indicator is contraceptive prevalence using modern method. And the third one is unmet need for family planning. Using the 3 estimated results, we can calculate the SDG indicator 3.7.1 proportion of demand satisfied for family planning. And these results can be used for local intervention and programming. To summarize, small error estimation is an alternative to obtain estimates of key indicators at lower geographic levels. It can contribute to SDG monitoring, programming, and other international agendas, as well as different development issues such as demographic dividend and women empowerment. To apply small error estimation to different policy and program issues, we recommend that not only looking into the relative numbers, but also the absolute numbers using population census. With the process of 2020 round of census, it brings the opportunities of duplicating the analysis to more countries and more indicators by integrating the recent population census with other survey data. Looking to future, there are areas around small error estimation that UNFPA is taking the effort. First, apply small error estimation to other SDG indicators, especially sexual and reproductive health related indicators. Second, target the location of the most vulnerable groups, for example, women aged 15 to 24. Third, link the results with other geospatial data for different development issues. For example, linking the unmet need for family planning with people's access to family planning services to find the geospatial gaps between supply and demand. Finally, carry out capacity development activities to help countries to strengthen the national capacity to do the estimation. And this is the area UNFPA has been consistently provide technical support to countries. I'll stop here and thank you very much for your attention. Please feel free to contact me if you have any questions or feedback.
Good morning, good evening. My name is Omar Seidu, Head of Demographic Statistics at the Ghana Statistical Service and coordinator of data for Sustainable Development Goals in Ghana. In 2017, Ghana held its first Data Roadmap Forum with support from the Global Partnership for Sustainable Development Data. And this laid the blueprint for monitoring the SDGs. As a result, a focus on new data methods has been established by Ghana Statistical Service, and several pilot projects and pieces of work to address data gaps have been initiated. These new data sources have opened the door to the opportunities around small area estimations. Today, I will take you through some existing uses, potential future applications, and the prerequisites that have paved the way for the use of this in Ghana. The Data for Good initiative is coordinated by Ghana Statistical Service, Flowminder, and Vodafone Ghana, with funding from Hewlett Foundation and Vodafone Foundation. It uses call detail records to estimate dynamic population densities and approximates mobility patterns. By using Vodafone data, we are able to spatially disaggregate population flows that show daily or seasonal population changes with a 48-hour lag. This has recently been used to analyze changes in mobility following government travel restrictions as part of the COVID-19 response. Mobility indicators such as number of trips between districts and dispersion indicators such as destination of trips originating in Accra and ending in and other regions were calculated, and we were able to tangibly capture the effect of the movement restrictions. Using new methods such as CDR, we were able to rapidly estimate intra and inter-district mobility across Ghana for the first time. Another upcoming application that we are putting the CDR to is enhancing the early warning system coordinated by the National Disaster Management Organization, NADMO. A population estimates layer in combination with other spatially vulnerable layers enable this system to perform proportional resourcing decisions for responding to emergencies happening in particular locations at a certain time of the day. So far, these resourcing decisions have relied on census projections that are kind of static. But the idea is that once we incorporate CDR and we're able to mitigate the biases, these static nighttime residential population projections can be replaced with dynamic estimates which reflect the spatially disaggregated average population densities at each hour of the day throughout the week. This will mean appropriate resourcing decisions in responding to incidents of disasters. COVID-19 Tracker is another application that can be found on GSS website, which displays spatially vulnerability analysis and key figures on the pandemic. Freum, who is a technical partner, supported GSS to use machine learning to infer vulnerability characteristics such as the average number of persons who smoke for each square kilometer of Ghana. This was made possible using macro data from recent household surveys such as the multiple indicator cluster survey, the demographic and health survey, among others. And these, by generating district means from the macro data, were able to estimate spatially disaggregated prevalence of hand washing behavior per capita and other localized vulnerability indicators to create a spatially vulnerability distribution with resolution of 1 square kilometer across the country. And this provided an opportunity to understand areas where people have previously reported that they do not have water or soap at home for hand washing. And because COVID required that everybody should be washing their hands every time with soap and water. And if you do not have water and soap at home, it meant that that was difficult for you to do so. And so this provided opportunity for this, the local government to understand which parts of their areas have these challenges. The dashboard was developed by GSS with support from Imagery and the GPSZD. Grade 3 are also involved in the preparation of the Ghana's population housing census. By using satellite data, Grade 3 is assisting GSS in creating georeferenced data on the number of structures, the road footprint, and the enumeration area boundaries. This enables a validation of settlement extent and can be used to determine the difficulty of working in an enumeration area during the census period. For example, the slides shows the various complexity indicators for one district in the northern region of Ghana. By determining accessibility and coverage of enumeration areas, GSS is able to inform appropriate data collection logistics, and so that we are able to move the necessary logistics to the various areas that they are needed. The upcoming census exercise is an opportunity to validate the reliability of both the enumeration areas, georeferences, and the estimates produced by non-traditional data sources and new methods. So far, in test samples of the spatial vulnerability analysis in the COVID-19 dashboard, we saw slight variations in values estimated and sampled, but the values from the graded data provided us with a fair idea of what to expect in those areas. And we think this is very important in this context. As a future application, potential use, we're combining the thick and narrow survey data with the thin and wide big data. GSS is able to explore the possibilities of combining this to provide poverty estimates. As part of the Data for Now initiative, GSS is looking at providing national poverty profiles currently generated every 5 years from survey data by ensuring that the incorporation of satellite data, CDRs, to this, we should be able to provide district level estimates and every year. This is important because over the years, we have only been able to provide poverty estimates at the regional level and every 5 years. And this has not adequately helped policies because poverty interventions have largely been one size fits all. And we believe that by providing local level estimates, we should be able to do better. And so this project is seeking to combine the survey data, the census data, Earth observation data, as well as CDR to provide annual poverty estimates for every district in Ghana. Now, benefits of the data, lessons learned from an NSO perspective. For an NSO, the benefit of non-traditional data sources and new methods are clear. Firstly, they present more granularity in who is being left behind. By spatially disaggregating social data such as poverty, food insecurity, education, health, and all the like, we are better able to determine who is being left behind so that interventions can better target them. Secondly, spatially disaggregated data makes evidence more accessible to researchers and policymakers, which in turn allows official statistics to take a more prominent role in decision-making in the country. Following the launch of the Imagery COVID-19 dashboard, it was presented and GSS had the opportunity of being invited to become part of the COVID-19 National Technical Coordinating Committee. And we believe this could not have happened if we had not been able to provide data that was quite relevant, granular, and more timely. This appointment actually provided us a direct platform for the GSS to disseminate evidence about the pandemic to decision makers. The access to data and methods would not have been possible without viewing the project through an ecosystem perspective. In our CDR work, the inner ecosystem consists of GSS, Vodafone Ghana, Flowminder, National Communications Authority, the National Disaster Management Organization, and the Ghana Health Service. But there are many other organizations on the periphery. By considering the needs and concerns of all parties, from the data protection to sustainability considerations, a permissive environment can be created for such experimental data. A strong local data ecosystem enables initiatives to design inclusive governance structures and cultivate shared ownership. The examples discussed today are largely from pilot projects. As such, there has been a need for substantial technical capacity building. This includes analytical methods, visualization of results, and privacy and data governance capabilities. Progress has been made in training in-house staff members on software and foundational data science skills. And GSS is currently establishing a data science directorate, which will help us mainstream all these new data sources in our system to ensure continuous production of data. And this, we believe, is a step in the right direction by ensuring that we are able to mainstream the data science capabilities we are currently building by providing more timely and lower disaggregated data that are needed to inform policies in the country.
On behalf of the organizers at the United Nations and the World Bank, the presenters, and all of our colleagues involved in this important work, we'd like to thank you for your time and attention. We hope that we provided a useful look at the new data and new methods for small area estimation that we are working on, and how we are leveraging these innovations to empower our member countries in developing data-driven policies to ensure that no one is left behind as we progress toward the end of global poverty and the achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals. Please do reach out if you have questions on the material presented today. And have a good day, afternoon, or evening wherever you are. Thank you and stay safe.